Claudia, so.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays at the Museum. I'm Amanda Harrison, a Community Engagement Manager for the DIA. Thank you so much for joining us in honor of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Docents Frank Chen, Freda Giblin, Jill Best, and Ray Henney are going to take you through the DIA's newly renovated Asian galleries. Enjoy works from that span enjoy works that span thousands of years up to the present day. Christine Mark, our manager of volunteer development, is here to take your questions throughout the program. To ask a question, log into YouTube using your Gmail account or by leaving a public comment on this Facebook page. Kathleen McBroom is behind the scenes running our slide deck. After the program, we'd like to invite you to come down to the museum to explore the galleries on your own. The museum has returned to its regular business hours, and general admission is free for residents in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. Now, to take us on this virtual tour, please welcome our highly trained docents, Frank Chen, Freda Giblin, Jill Best, and Ray Henney. Hi, team. How are you?
Hey, Amanda.
Hello there. We're good.
I am thrilled to be with Frank. This is Frank's first time doing Thursday at the museum. You'll find him be extremely knowledgeable. And Freda and Jill have done this before, and I very much appreciate working with them. As Amanda said, today's tour is part of the DIA's programming this month to celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander heritage and culture. Jill, Frank, and Freda will be presenting highlights of art from the DIA's Robert and Catherine Jacobs Asian Wing, which opened in November 2018. Next slide, please. The DIA's Asian Wing is on the north side of the first floor and displays approximately 140 of the DIA's 7,000 objects in its Asian collection. The DIA periodically rotates this art to it displays in these wings, so the visitors may have a different experience each time they visit. The wing consists of 5 galleries dedicated to Asian art: Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Indian, and Southeast Asian, and Buddhist art. Next slide, please. Those galleries are thoughtfully designed to facilitate a visitor's understanding of the wonderful and splendid heritage of Asian art and culture. Today we present works from all 5 of the Asian art galleries. We hope you will enjoy this wonderful highlight pieces that they'll be presenting, and it'll help you gain an appreciation of the beauty and rich heritage of Asian cultures. We begin with Jill, who will be discussing works from both the Buddhist and Hindu traditions. Jill?
Thank you. Yes, so first of all, we are visiting the gallery where Buddhist traditions are displayed. This space is truly cross-cultural, and the objects displayed represent a time frame of 1,500 years right up to the present day. First, though, before we look at this image in detail, some brief context about Buddhism. The Buddha was a real person, born in India in the mid-500s BCE. He was born as Prince Siddhartha Gautama, a prince of the Shakya clan. Therefore, he was born into luxury. He would have been elaborately dressed and adorned with jewels. He is called Shakimuni here because that means sage of the Shaklas. And this is before he was the Buddha. Even though he grew up in luxury and was surrounded by everything anybody thinks they could want, he was profoundly dissatisfied as he perceived that we humans become attached to unimportant and transitory things, however beautiful they may seem. This attraction to impermanence results in anxiety, dissatisfaction, and unhappiness, which the Buddha identified as fundamental suffering, and that traps us in the endless cycle of death and rebirth. So he gave up his luxurious way of life. He lived like a monk and for a time practiced extreme self-deprivation, which is what we see here in this small wooden sculpture. He eventually decided that this extreme way of life was not helpful in discovering the true nature of reality. And so he embraced the middle way, not extreme luxury, not extreme deprivation, but somewhere in the middle. And he spent a whole lifetime of meditation in order to understand the true permanent nature of reality. Now, once you have achieved this supreme insight, you become enlightened and released from that endless cycle of death, rebirth, and suffering. This enlightenment and release is the aim of Buddhism. So let's take a look now closely at what we see here. This is a very small wooden hand-carved sculpture. It's only about 12 inches high, and it was created in China, as you see from the label, in the late 13th or early 14th century. You can see when you look closely traces of gold paint and red lacquer. Now, this is Shakimuni before he becomes the Buddha, before his enlightenment. Notice how emaciated he is. You can see his ribs and the bones in his legs stand out. He wears a monk's robe, and look how he himself is folded over in deep meditation and concentration. Even though this is a small object, it has many details. For example, the toenails are really long. You can't really see that in the slide, but you can get close to this in the museum and pick out these details. And the toenails are long, of course, reflecting his time in the wilderness. And even though he's not yet achieved enlightenment, he does have some of the marks of the Buddha. Next slide, please.
Jill, it's amazing that this still has its original paint on it after
Yes.
all these hundreds of years.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes, that must make it very precious.
I believe that this is one of very few extant from this time and place. And the gold paint would have been more copious and more obvious, and it reflects his knowledge, if you like, and his own radiance.
His enlightenment. That's real interesting.
Exactly. Now, I think you can see in both of these slides the long earlobes and also tight curls. Now, the long earlobes, because when he was a prince, he would have worn really heavy bejeweled earrings which stretched out his earlobes. And the tight curls reflect his matted hair after a long time in the wilderness. As a prince, he would have had long hair, but this is short and matted. And have a look at the left-hand slide where I think you can see a rectangular cut. This would have contained objects of a special nature, somewhere where sacred objects would have been placed, transforming the sculpture into a sacred image. My apologies for my phone. Special substances, special herbs would have been put into this case, transforming it from a sculpture into a really sacred object. Next slide, please. So here we have a contemporary piece. Now this piece is not on view. The Shakimuni I've just been talking about is on view. And in fact, it's very good to go and see it because it's so small. You can see all the details, and the way it's displayed in the gallery, you can walk around it and see it in detail. Now, Water Drops was, when it hangs, it's in the Buddhist gallery. The artist is Korean, and you can see that it was painted in 1977. Now, it's oil on canvas, and if you're up close to this, the individual water drops are almost luminous. You feel as if you could just pick them up in your hand. But of course, we know if you were to pick up a water drop, it would immediately disappear. You couldn't do it. You can't do it. So that reflects the ephemeral nature of what we perceive around us. You think you can pick it up? You think you can touch it? No, it goes away. At the same time, the artist says, and I quote, "Water remembers everything and aids meditation." So you've got two things here at once, if you like, emphasizing the ephemeral nature of what seems reality, but at the same time, water is also eternal.
Jill, that is fascinating about the place of water in meditation. So many different kinds of uses of that tool of water.
Yes.
Meditation ponds in different cultures.
There you go. Yes.
Extremely interesting.
And I think it's a piece that is fascinating and open to many different interpretations as well, which is why I find it so attractive.
Terrific.
Okay.
We don't seem to have any questions, Jill, if you want to proceed to your next pieces.
I will. So there we go. Thank you. So now we're going to look at a Hindu goddess as displayed in the South Asian gallery. So let's just have a look briefly at what we see. This is a large stone image created in the 1900s out of basalt, and it's a large piece. It's 46 inches high, so this is a big piece. We'll get to looking at the Yogini goddess in detail in a moment, but first, a word about Hindu traditions. This is an ancient religion which originated in India about 3,000 years ago. And unlike other world religions, there is not one individual founder. The Vedas are the earliest known Hindu scriptures, written in early Sanskrit, and by tradition created between 1500 BCE and 1000 BCE. So it's as if the religion grew organically from several different cultural traditions. It's now the world's third largest religion. In the Hindu tradition, God is considered infinite, boundless, all-encompassing, and as humans, we are therefore incapable of understanding the true nature of God. And so the multiple gods in the tradition help humans connect to the divine. Now, this connection is not just something ephemeral, it's considered to be dynamic and real. The connection to the gods is through Darshan, which means looking. Darshan is fundamental. Devotees do not worship idols. On the contrary, they believe that the God is actually present in the sculpture. So imagine you're looking at this deity in the eyes, which you must do to create darshan. That deity is actually present and sees you too. So this sacred contact is through this looking, and this may take place in homes, temples, processions, anywhere. Now there are three supreme deities: Shiva, the destroyer; Vishnu, the preserver; and then Shakti, the supreme goddess, who here is manifested as Parvati. Notice she's beautifully S-shaped, very gracious looking, very graceful looking. However, Parvati has another manifestation as a fierce goddess. So here's our Yogini, the fierce form of Shakti, the supreme goddess. So we'll have a look now at what we see. In many ways, she's really alluring. Her body is voluptuous, curvaceous. She has curves in all the right places. She has jewels around her waist and around her neck, and she seems to have some sort of crown, but certainly she has an elaborate headdress. However, as well as being alluring, she's also repulsive and scary. Look at her hideous fangs. Can you see that her mouth has fangs? She has bulging eyes, and she's adorned with snakes. If you look at her armband, it's snakes. Her bracelet, snakes. And then over her body, she's adorned with a snake. And then in her hand, she has a skull cup, which is hollowed out of a hollowed out skull of a human being. She holds a club, but she also has a shield. Now, yoginis are ferocious in the protection of the truth. She must be more terrifying than any negative belief. They are worshipped, yoginis are worshipped in a special temple. Temple is circular. Multiple yogini statues face inward. So a devotee in the temple is literally surrounded by the power of Shakti. Now, this fierce form, the yogini, can be very dangerous to non-believers, but they grant special favors and special powers to believing initiates. So only some people, believers and devotees, can venture into the yogini temple. And a final word, actually, a note about yoga, because obviously the yogini references yoga. But the word is quite different from what we understand as yoga. Historically, yoga means to harness the power of the divine. So a yogini harnesses that divine power.
Jill, I think it's fascinating that in the Hindu tradition, sculpture that we would normally in the Western culture feel as evil or
Yes.
represent evil is actually a defender of truth and what's
Yes.
good. And I think that's just extremely interesting.
I find that to be a very important and potent message, actually. We should all be fierce in the defense of the truth, whatever our truth is.
That's outstanding, Jill. I'm not seeing any questions. So if you're done, it's time for Frank. And Frank will be presenting two important pieces from the DIA's Chinese Gallery that concern interesting aspects of Chinese culture and of Chinese concepts of art. Frank?
Thank you, Ray. As I said, I'm going to introduce you to what I think is the most important Chinese artworks in our excellent Chinese gallery. The first one is from the late 16th century, and the second one is from the early 17th century. So that puts them both within the Ming Dynasty, which lasts from 1368 to 1644 in the Common Era. Now, when one looks at the Chinese paintings, there are basically three basic elements that one looks at. First, there's the graphical painting itself, as you can see in the lower half over here. Then there is always some sort of calligraphy, a poem, some introduction, text, etc. And then thirdly, there are some stamps or seals. They're often in red and scattered throughout the painting. Now, in this painting then, which is from the famous artist Wen Zhenming, and his name in Chinese is on the top left parts of it. Yes, that's Wen Zhenming from the Ming Dynasty again, who hails from Suzhou, which is west of Shanghai. And we get to look at all three of these elements. Now, the title of this painting is called The First Prose Poem on the Red Cliff. The painting itself is from 1417 to 1559, which is the Ming Dynasty. This is a very long scroll. It's almost 8 feet long and hung in a vertical manner. The painting is in the lower half, and the calligraphy is on the upper half. Now, some of you might be familiar with the word red cliff. In Chinese, that would be 赤壁, and this is called a red cliff painting, or 赤壁图, which is the robe of white. Three Chinese words that I put in over there. Now, 赤壁 is a place along the Yangtze River. In the winter of the year 208, there was a very famous naval battle fought there, and which completely changed the history of China. Of course, some of you may have also heard about or saw the movie Red Cliff, which is about the battle. But this painting by Wen Zhenming is not about that battle. Rather, it's about a very celebrated incident that happened almost 900 years later. Okay. What happened is that on a brisky autumn night, very well lit by a bright moon, a Song Dynasty poet, Su Xi, invited a couple of friends to go on a tour of the Red Cliff by boat. Now, Su Xi, whom people more commonly know as Su Dongbo, was a very, very famous poet, as well as artists and painters. He is as well known to Chinese people as Shakespeare is to the English-speaking world. Okay. On that night, Su Dongbo composed two poems, or prose poems, and they are now his famous 赤壁赋, which is the one that usually is called the Red Cliff Odes. In this painting, then, Wen Zhenming captured the scene, and we'll look at the details in the next one. Size. Okay, first of all, here's the foreground. The foreground is, of course, the near shore of the Yangtze River, and you can see some trees, as well as some grasses. Okay, but there's not much of a sign of occurrence going on. So everything is very calm that night. I have also circled one of the red seals, and that is Wen Zhenming's own seal. Just like a Western artist will sign their paintings, Chinese artists would always put a red seal. It could be anywhere, it could be in the front, it could be in the back. In this in this case, he decided to put one in the lower right corner. Next slide, please. Here is the middle ground now, and we see the boat. Okay, there are several people on it. Sudongbo is the one that's standing up, and he's having a good time. He's singing, he's reciting poems, and they're all drinking wine in this boat, and looking at and enjoying those red cliffs, which is the overhanging cliffs that is very menacing. Okay, and with a few simple strokes, Wen Zhenming has, really gave you a sense of how the whole scenery is like. Okay, now you might wonder, how do we know about all these details that I just mentioned? Well, let's look at the top part of the painting. Next slide, please. Yes, the next slide, this slide shows then the Red Cliff prose poem, the first of the two. The 侧壁赋. It's composed of 643 words. The first few lines tells exactly what Zhou Dongbo was touring and drinking and singing and reciting poems. Let me tell you a little bit about Wen Zhenming. Wen Zhenming was one of the 4 artists who pioneered the Wu school of painting, Wu being referring to the city of Suzhou. The other 3 are Shen Zhou, who was actually Wen Zhenming's teacher, Shou Ying, and Tang Ying. Our DIA also have paintings by Shen Zhou and Shou Ying, so you might want to also look at those too. Now, Wen Zhenming's father was an important official, and Wen Zhenming tried to become an official. He tried to take the exam 9 times and still failed. Of course, he was now become the most famous artist. And he only finally succeeded becoming an official when he was 40, and then he quits after just 3 months. So obviously, he is really more accomplished as an artist. Wen Zhenming painted this painting when he was 89 years old, and the year before he passed away at 90 years old. Now let's focus on the calligraphy itself. When we look at the characters, you can see that the characters are very separate from each other and very well separated. They are not tied together at all. Now in Chinese calligraphy, they're considered to be 3 perfections for Chinese painting. Painting, poetry are the other 2, and calligraphy is also one of the 3. In Chinese script, there are basically 5 basic styles. We don't have to, go through all of the ones, but what is on the bottom line over there is the word water, written in the 5 different types of scripts. Now, to the one on your right is the regular script. That will be the script that everybody was taught. Everybody knows how to read them. But then there is also, I'll point out right now, the cursive script, and right in the middle, called Cao Su. Now, Cao Su is what artists would use. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, here we are looking at the calligraphy by Dong Qichang. Dong Qichang wrote this is really a copy of Zhang Su's record of government officials on a stone wall. And it's about 1608 to 09. Now, Dong Qichang's copy is from an original, which is really on a carving on a stone wall. But the stone wall itself was destroyed even way before Dong Qichang ever saw it. So Dong Qichang, what happened was that there was a rubbing of the original stone wall. The original script by Zhang Su, who was a very famous calligraphy in the Song Dynasty, was in standard script. What Dong Qichang did here is to write it in a cursive script, which then makes it a lot more all the words are almost like a painting by itself. Next slide, please. This is a very, very long script scroll, almost 30 feet long. So we'll only be able to look at parts of it. Here is the beginning parts of it. It wrote in Chinese script, of course, you read from right to left and from top to bottom. So that's where it starts. The start is really just an introduction of what Zhang Su will write about. As you can see, now the words are really very hard to look at and interpret. So it makes it, most of the Chinese people may not be completely understood every word of it. Next slide, please.
That's interesting, Frank, that this, again, comparing it to Western, writing needed to be clear. What's important is what the words be understood. And what you're indicating here is that the beauty of the stroke is as important or more important than the understanding of what the letters or words mean. And I think that's a very interesting concept, Frank. I mean, it's the aesthetic for the aesthetic's sake, which
exactly,
which didn't really enter the mainstream in Western culture until I guess the 19th century, with the Impressionists who were influenced by that very concept.
Very interestingly, you brought up the concept of the Impressionism, because this is really a form of Impressionism. Okay, it's not the words that matter; it's how you feel, how the artist feel about what he wrote. So we always talk about how the strength of the brushstroke, or the chi, whether how the emotions come through just from the writing of itself. As you can see, I cannot read all these words myself, but also that you can see that there are a whole bunch of red seals, stamps over there. And the red stamps are not by the artist now, but by somebody else. The yellow one, the yellow arrow that's pointed to a big circle over there, let me show you that in the right, on your right. And if I may loosely translate what the word says, is on the top one. It says, Emperor Qinglong has seen this piece and stamped it as a royal treasure. Okay, so what happened was that Qinglong came hundreds of years later and came across this scroll, and Dong Qicang was one of his favorite calligraphy, so he puts his stamp on it. Right underneath that, and a little bit smaller, is the Empress stamp. Okay. So, and also that, I also show you one of the words which is highlighted in blue color. I recognize that word. Okay, that's because that's my last name, Chen. So, so what happened is
what a coincidence that you happen to turn to the page, Frank.
Well, that is because Zhang Su's collaborator is Chen Jill, which is the two words over there. Let me quote Dong Qicang himself wrote about why copying just words and without any particular context is interesting. This is what he wrote. The wonder of copying is to experience the spirit of genius. And okay, and that's it. Christine, any questions?
Not at this time, Frank, but I sure love you showing us all the different types of calligraphy and the name Chen in Chinese. That's great. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Frank. That was really very enlightening and really deepened our appreciation, certainly my appreciation for that form of art, and not necessarily just a utilitarian object. So we're going to now go to Freda, who will be covering pieces from Japanese gallery that focus on samurai traditions and the culture of tea and teaism. Freda?
Thank you, Ray. In this segment, we'll look at objects in the Japanese gallery that were made about the same time as the Chinese calligraphy you just saw. I'll talk about art during the Edo period of 1603 to 1868, a relatively peaceful time that followed many decades of war. We'll discuss two topics, samurai and tea utensils. Sound incongruous? What may be surprising to many is that in addition to their military side, samurai were major supporters of the arts. And what other cultural image of Japan could be more immediate in your mind than the art of tea? Let's begin our exploration. If someone says samurai, this might be an image that goes through your mind. This armor and helmet were worn around the first half of the 17th century. It was lighter than previous versions, offered more protection, fit the body closely, and featured protections not seen in earlier horse-mounted types of warfare. In the next slide, we see a portrait of Hojo Yuchanaga from the same time frame, made by the chief court painter during the early Edo period. Excuse me. We see a different side to the samurai's life. This painting recently came on display, so come see it before it goes into storage this fall. Samurai have a long history of balancing the warrior arts with cultural interests. Bunbu is a term that describes this breadth of interest. Bun refers to civilian arts, and Bu refers to warrior traditions. Because samurai were responsible for military and civil rule, and the emperor led the people spiritually and culturally, samurai portraits announced some new messages. First, it demonstrates their growing wealth, which they started to amass around 1200 to 1300. And so portraits were a status symbol. In addition, samurai portraits assert and disseminate their right to power. It was during the 12th century that we started to see the first warrior government as samurai upheld legal order and adjudicated disputes. Hojo Yuchanaga lived in the mid-1600s and was retainer to the Tokugawa shogunate. He improved military strategy, brought fame to the Hojo School of Military Tactics, and was an accomplished map maker. In addition, just like Zhang Yul Kim, who made many paintings of water drops after the horrors he experienced during the Korean War, Hojo Yuchanaga was devoted to Zen Buddhist teachings. The calligraphy above the portrait alludes to his many attributes. In looking at his portrait, let's see how or what signs we see that disseminate his right to power. He wears a red, round-necked ceremonial robe that has a vine scroll arabesque pattern. In the front, there is a sword shield in blue. In the back, the hem of his undercoat is folded. He sits on a mat, holding an official scepter in both hands. A rectangular-shaped family crest of the Hojo clan is woven throughout the fabric. On your left, you can see the tip of a sword. Hojo Yuchanaga worked in the imperial household. Those in the highest ranks, the first through the fourth, wore black robes. He was of the fifth rank, which wore red robes, and those of the sixth and lower ranks wore light blue robes. It was the elite samurai who supported the tea culture, employed tea masters, and practiced a number of arts associated with the tea ritual, such as flower arranging, painting, and calligraphy. In the next slide, you see a special table in the DIA's Japanese gallery, which demonstrates how the host prepares and serves tea for guests. On the right side of that table you'll see a number of tea vessels on display, and they were created between the 15th and 17th centuries, like this one in the next slide. New tea would have been cultivated by farmers, placed in a jar like this, as well as the jar in the next slide, and transported to Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. These were made by coiled ropes of clay. The jar with lugs would have had a cover where rope was tied to the lugs to keep it in place. The lugs were made of roped clay and pressed into the jar's shoulder, and the artist's thumbprints can still be seen. A third slide compares these to a Chinese vase from several centuries earlier. During the time of the female musicians that Frank, well, Frank hasn't shown it yet, but he will be showing. But these were from the Chinese vases from the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907. The point in showing these ceramics is that while one creature might have created a shape, color, or style that became prevalent, another culture frequently finds ways of taking that object and infusing new meaning and beauty that enriches or transforms its original context. This is like Chano-yu, the Japanese art of tea, where the ritual, which originated in China, took on an important new meaning when translated into the Japanese culture. In Chano-yu, there's an underlying philosophy of tranquility, simplicity, and elegance. The rituals of Chano-yu take many years to master and are built on a philosophy that requires mindfulness in creating the atmosphere, such as arranging a tea room with flowers, calligraphy, and incense. Appreciating beauty is part of the social interaction among guests and hosts. But there is an underlying aesthetic that pervades the way of tea, which is somewhat different from that of the Western world. And that is finding beauty in imperfection, called wabi. Or, to quote Kakuzo Okakura, author of the Book of Tea from 1906, Teaism is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence. These storage jars provide examples of the rustic simplicity that the warrior society prized in their tea practices. Cherishing beauty in imperfection, or wabi, means that accidental fire marks, ash deposits, thumbprints, and cord marks become valued.
Freda?
Yes,
Oh,
great.
yeah, I have some questions about these are fascinating and extremely interesting. Are the tea leaves what is carried in the jar, or is the tea that's already been brewed is being what carried in the
That's
jar?
a good question, Ray. From what I understand, the new tea leaves would have been placed in these jars.
And
I can't imagine lugging this around, but apparently it was the new tea leaves that went into these, from what I've read.
And so the lugs, as you call them, in the center jar.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You said that ropes were used to tie down the lid.
Right.
And in the Chinese one on the right, I take it that those loops had the same purpose.
Good eye. Yes, lugs as well, probably for a cover that would have been placed on top.
And I have one other question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fascinating that imperfection is valued in the samurai tradition. I really think that is interesting. And it maybe reflects an acceptance of the human condition. I don't know. I'm just
Absolutely.
It's very interesting that. Anyways, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. That's a great point, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit thank you for putting that in people's minds. So hold that thought.
Okay.
Okay. So what's the connection between samurai and tea? Although records indicate that a tea drinking event in 729 might have introduced tea from China to Japan, it was during the 13th century when Japanese Buddhists who studied Chan Buddhism in southern China brought the practice of tea and actual tea plants back to Japan. The tea ritual used by these Zen Buddhist priests was taken up by the elite samurai, which then fueled its rise in popularity. And at that time, tea preparation involved a powdered form of tea that was whisked with hot water and which then created a foam. So by the 15th century, the way of tea that started with a Zen Buddhist ritual became popular throughout Japan. So let's look at the next slide. We'll see a popular style of tea bowl from that time with a black glaze. Now, Senyo Rikyu, from 1522 to 1592, was the most famous and influential Japanese tea master, and his patron was a warlord who collected famous tea objects. This Minnow tea bowl reflects Senrikyu's strong preference for simple black tea bowls and his aesthetic of imperfection. Made around 1570, the rim flares out slightly. The sides are relatively straight. The base is low and broad. Most minnow tea bowls were made using a potter's wheel and were then hand sculpted with a spatula. The heavy black glaze was developed specifically for use on these cylindrical bowls. In the next slide, we're going to look at a tea scoop and think about hand carving a scoop and its container out of bamboo. If made by tea masters, the tea scoop was probably the most valuable object utensil. And in the next slide, we'll see the tea scoop next to the tea bowl. So the concept of what is valued in a tea ritual can be puzzling to many. So to try to understand this Japanese aesthetic, let's turn again to Kakuzo Okakura, whose book on tea grew out of a series of talks he gave in the salon of Isabella Stewart Gardner several years before becoming the curator of Asian arts at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He tells us that the evolution of tea ideals during the Chinese Tang and Sung dynasties, roughly 600 to 1200, incorporated philosophic ideals from Taoism, which then influenced the southern Chinese school of Buddhism, called Chan Buddhism. Chan Buddhism was then translated into the Japanese version called Zen Buddhism. As we view this tea scoop in the next slide of the tea caddy made of wood and which held powdered tea, we marvel at the variety of materials and textures that make up the way of tea. Okakura explains that in the tea room, the fear of repetition is a constant. Various objects should be selected so that no color or design should be repeated. If you have a living flower, a painting of flowers is not allowable. A cup with a black glaze should not be associated with a tea caddy of black lacquer. The pillar of the tokonoma should be of a different kind of wood from other pillars in order to break any suggestion of monotony. In contrast to a rustic tea bowl, this small but striking lacquered wooden tea caddy would have introduced a graceful note of richness into the stark simplicity of the Japanese tea room. It is a Natsumi container for fine powdered green tea called matcha, and it was used by important tea ceremony masters in 1563. Decorated in gold, this is one of the most dazzling and well-preserved extant Natsumi of the Edo period, with a dramatic style that creates zigzag lines dividing the surface into black and gold areas. So some final words on the ideals by which a sumptuous tea caddy and rustic bowl are both revered in the Japanese way of tea. So in our last slide, let's take a look at these as we contemplate some of the principles that Okakura tells us derived from Taoism and Buddhism and were infused into the tea ritual. And Ray, here's where I think we can answer your question. So let's learn a few lessons from each of these philosophies. From Taoism, we learn of beauty. Taoism is the art of being in the world as it deals with the present and our constant adjustment to our surroundings. Taoism accepts the mundane and tries to find beauty in a world of woe and worry. In Taoism, it is a process that is of interest. The process of completing, and not completion itself, is what is important. From Zen Buddhism, we learn that self-realization can be attained through consecrated meditation, as we heard earlier in Jill's presentation. Zen Buddhism tells us that many things impede the perception of truth, which can only be reached through the working of our minds as we attempt to comprehend the opposites through insights. Finally, in Buddhism, the mundane is of equal importance with the spiritual, so there is greatness in the smallest incidents of life. In short, tea is not just an idealized form of drinking, it is a religion of the art of life. So as you view these tea objects, perhaps we can understand why Okakura calls tea the cup of humanity. He says, Teaism is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid. It inculcates purity and harmony, the mystery of mutual charity, the romanticism of the social order. It is a worship of the imperfect, as it is a tender attempt to accomplish something possible in this impossible thing we know as life. Christine, are there any questions?
We have a few nice comments about how fascinating and interesting it is, and how it would be so great to have all the students, who are studying in different levels of school to be learning some of these things.
Great.
So, yeah, thank you, Freda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Freda. That was really enlightening. Finally, we have Jill presenting an iconic work from the Korean gallery. Jill? Oh, we need to unmute her. There we go.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a look at the moon jar in the Korean gallery because moon jars have become a symbol of Korean cultural identity, which really prizes harmony, simplicity, minimalist beauty. But the moon jar started not as an art object, but as a very practical solution to a storage problem. They were made from at least the early 17th century. So the moon jars are rather obviously named for the shape of the two hemispheres which are stacked one on top of another. Each half is shaped in the potter's wheel, and then the two sides are balanced, joined together with clay and shaped by hand. The jar is then dipped in white tinted glaze and fired in a kiln. So they're relatively simple to make and provide excellent storage, which was the original purpose. Scholars believe that they were often used for food storage, either for ingredients like honey or soy sauce or maybe grains. Therefore, as a result of this use, moon jars just became regular and necessary everyday household items and part of ordinary domestic life. And in this utilitarian form, as I think I said, they date from the early 17th century, it's considered. However, later in the 18th century, the Korean royal kilns produced highly refined versions for the aristocracy. So the moon jars were no longer purely useful, but increasingly became art objects and almost symbols of Korea. Next slide, please. So here we see a contemporary work of art by the artist Ik Jun Kang, a Korean American, and he makes the point that the moon jar is a major influence in his art. And looking here, Happy World, Scattered Crumbs, which you see is contemporary piece, the moon jar is a repeated image. The arrows on the slide just pick out some, but you can look at the whole piece, and the moon jar is the most often repeated image. By the way, it's really fun to look at this piece. It's right near the moon jar in the Korean gallery, and it really shows the identity of the artist, who is Korean American. So some of the other little squares show everyday American things. Interesting to see what he has picked out. But the moon jar, above all, since the artist says that is the major influence on his art. So now
Jill,
yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, Jill, the gallery, in the Great Gallery, the moon jar that you're showing, just even though it's a simple item, it's something about the glaze and the color and that simple form that really pops out at the viewers.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's no wonder it's become almost a symbol.
And I think it's that very simplicity that makes it seem tranquil, harmonious, and that is kind of reflects Korean culture, I understand. It's very satisfying somehow to look at.
Exactly. And I think that's a terrific word for it.
Yeah, that's how I feel anyway. So then let's just go back or go and look at the moon jar again by itself. There we go. Interestingly, and this correlates with what Freda was saying about imperfections in Japanese ceramics and in the tea storage. As moon jars have become increasingly collector's items or not just purely utilitarian, what would have been considered flaws in production have now become treasures, so that any variation in the glaze or imbalance in the shape are much prized. I think you can see here that the rim at the top is not completely uniform. It's not straight, it's slightly lower on the right side. And in the gallery, it's difficult to see. There are subtle variations in the glaze, which once would have been considered to be flaws, but now they're treasures. The royal kilns that started to make moon jars were an independent business also. And so gradually, moon jars are made just for the general populace. And they become art objects increasingly as they are known in the West. And it's only recently that moon jars have entered museum collections. We acquired ours in 1984. So that's moon jars.
Thank you, Jill. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm not seeing any questions, and we're almost through with our hour. I want to thank Frank and Jill and Freda for a very informative discussion today, and introduction into Asian art. And thank you, visitors, for joining us today. The DIA is presenting many other activities to commemorate the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We invite you to check out the DIA's website for details of other programming. There are several special exhibits currently at the DIA, 3 of which I want to bring to your attention because they will be ending soon. The first is the magnificently beautiful, by her hand, Artesima Gentileschi and women artists in Italy from 1500 to 1800, which ends on May 28th, a must-see. The second is a long-running, because it's a favorite, exhibition called Detroit Style, Car Design in the Motor City. And it features a lot of very beautiful and interesting cars and design, information on design. That ends on June 5th. Finally, Detroit's own Shirley Woodson, her exhibition entitled Shield of the Nile Reflections, which is beautiful contemporary paintings, ends June 12th. So we encourage everyone to visit DIA before these three wonderful exhibitions are no longer presented. Next week on Thursdays at the museum, we'll be presenting another live Dosan tour. It'll be the highlights of pieces in the DIA's collections that are visitors' favorites and have a significant place in history, and it will mark the return of my dear friend Howard Rosenberg. So we hope you can join us for next week. And until then, be safe and be well. Thanks so much.